It's quite sort of interesting to see that the main theme of the conference this time is focused on demographics, because as most of you know, that there are two drivers of economic growth. One is the increase in productivity, and two is the increase in the labor force. And I find there's so much analysis which goes on about productivity and what's happening to productivity and which countries are seeing a productivity miracle, and as if that is the only key to economic growth. But I think what is underappreciated is that if you really look at history, especially in post-war history, the global economy has grown at a pace of nearly 4% every year on average. Half of that contribution to economic growth has come from the labor force and half from productivity. And the good thing is that when it comes to the labor force, we are able to measure that much more accurately compared to productivity. And the forecasts that people make about labor force tend to be much more accurate than about productivity. So I think that it's very interesting that we're focusing on this because there are some very big changes going on there regarding the global population scene. Most people have an anchoring bias, which is that they are focused on what has happened in the last few years and decades, and that shapes their opinion about what is happening now or happening in the future. So as you can see here, that the global population was basically flat for many centuries, and then we had this massive upward surge in global population that began about a couple of 100 years ago. And so most people still feel that the biggest challenge for the global economy or for the planet is that we have so many people to feed and what's really going to happen. But for practitioners, whether it's economists, business people, or investors really, what I find is that the big change, which is much more relevant, is how the population worldwide now is slowing down quite dramatically, the population growth. So we have gone from concerns about a population bomb, which is about how the world's population is exploding and what to do about that. That was the dominant theme in the world in the 1960s and 70s and 1980s, to the fact that now what we are seeing is that in many parts of the world, the population, especially the working age population, people between the age of 15 to 64, that cohort is shrinking quite rapidly in many parts of the world. But just to put this into context here, the world's working age population grew at a pace of nearly 2% for much of post-war history. The global economy grew at 4% for much of post-war history, mainly because of this, which is that never before in history had we seen such a high growth rate in the world's economy as we saw between 1950 and 2008. And that was mainly because this was the only period in which we saw such high increases in working age population, which happened for a number of reasons, from the fact that medical advances meant people were living longer, and increased education meant that many women were having fewer babies compared to what they were before. But that now is leading to a big slowdown in the world's population growth rate. So just look at this chart, how instructive it is, which is that we've had productivity miracles in the past, but we have never had a period when the world's population grew as rapidly as it did from 1950 to 2008. And that is the main reason why you ended up getting this global economy which grew at 4%. And this is something which politicians and even many analysts, I feel, still haven't adjusted themselves to. Like in the US, we keep seeing talk that how to get the US economy back to growing at 3 to 4%, as if that is the birthright of this economy. It's not, because if you look at it, the reason the US economy grew so rapidly from 1950 to 2008 was partly because we had this baby boom out there, and that baby boom is over. The working age population of the United States is projected to increase by, I think, 0.5% or so every year now for the foreseeable future. So that is a big slowdown compared to the increases we saw for much of post-war history. And this big increase in the world's working age population was also the reason why, for the first time, we saw these exceptional growth rates in some economies, whether it was China, Korea, Taiwan. One common characteristic they all shared was the fact that their population increases were very sharp in this period. The working age population increases, the dependency ratios came off. So that was very, very pronounced, and that's what helped these economies grow so rapidly now. But here's the reality, even in the developing world, that the population growth rates have slowed down dramatically, and the projected increase in the world's working age population in these developing economies now is just 1.1%, whereas in the miracle economies, the economies which we define as economies which grew at a pace of more than 6% for a decade, the average increase in their working age population was nearly 3% during those miracle years. So as you can see now that the population booms are increasingly rare, that to grow faster than 6%, economies generally needed a population growth rate of at least 2%. There are very few such economies in the world now. In fact, we have a majority of economies now in Asia where the large economies where the working age population is shrinking. This is another chart which sort of shows that if the working age population begins to shrink, the average economic growth rate that a country is able to experience is just 1.5%. And to me, this is the single biggest challenge for China, that we are still sort of wedded to the idea on how China can keep growing at 5, 6, maybe even 7%. But for the first time now, China's working age population is shrinking. And typically when a country's working age population shrinks, historically, its growth rate has been just 1.5%. At least there is no example of any major country in history that has been able to sustain a growth rate of 5 to 6% with a shrinking working age population. And for me, that's the main reason why I don't think that China's growth rate can sustain at anywhere close to 6% for the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, now there are about 40 countries in the world where the working age population is shrinking. In the 1980s, there were only 2 countries in the world where the working age population was shrinking in any year. For example, in 1985, those 2 countries were Afghanistan, Somalia. Basically, who cares, right? I mean, the entire world was seeing a big explosion in their working age population. And that now has changed. So where are these workers? Where is it that we can find still a big increase taking place in the working age population? A lot of this is in Africa, in countries such as India. Still, we are seeing that. But even here, to put this in context, these rates have come down very significantly. Like in India, the average fertility rate in the 1950s and 60s was 6 per family. That's now down to just over 2. So a big decrease has taken place every year. But look at the number of significant countries now projected to see a shrinkage in their working age population. Some very big countries from Germany to Japan, obviously we know about, where the population is outright shrinking, Russia, and as I said, the single biggest change here is China, where the working age population grew at a pace of 2% for much of the 80s and 90s, and now, as a long consequence of its one-child policy, that growth rate is shrinking. Some people ask me that that now that they've switched and they're easing on their one-child policy, will this begin to increase again? Yes, but it takes many decades for these changes to make their way through into the world's working age population out there. Now, of course, the flip side here is that if you get a sharp increase in your working age population, it is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for generating high economic growth. So look at the conversion rate here. We looked at countries here where the working age population grew by more than 2%, as I said, which is what sort of leads to miracle economies. How many of these economies were able to convert that into very high economic growth rate? About 25%. So having good demographics is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for generating high economic growth, because you have to convert it through other means. Otherwise, you can end up like you have situations in Africa and the Middle East, where despite high population growth rate, the economies have been in long periods of stagnation. So the big challenge for the global economy today is the race against depopulation. The issue is that what can countries do to try and increase their working age population? This sounds so counterintuitive, but you'd be surprised how many countries today across the world are taking steps to increase their working age population. There are three ways that you can do that. One is by having more immigrants. Two is by increasing the participation of women in the labor force. In fact, I don't think there's any country in the world where the female labor force participation is close to 100%, and there are very few countries in the world where it's higher than the male participation rate in the labor force. So you need to sort of increase female participation in the labor force. Or the third thing that you can do is to change the retirement ages, although that has major political consequences when you speak about that. Not quite popular to tell many of you here that you have to keep working till 70 and not till 60. But that is something which needs to be done as a third measure of increasing the world's working age population. But those are three steps that economies have to take. But look at this chart, which is that this shows how many economies this decade have been taking steps actively to increase immigrants to come to their countries. Because as we know that there's been a massive anti-immigrant backlash in many parts of the world, but there are many countries out here, from Australia to Canada, which have been trying to get more immigrants to come to counter the decrease in their own population growth rates at home. Because at the end, size does matter. Economies sort of do want to feel more significant as far as size is concerned. So the most open countries will obviously see the largest gains in net immigration. Germany saw mass protests when it accepted 1 million refugees in 2015, but it could accept that many every year for the next 15 years and still not counter the decline in its working age population. That is really what's happening out there. But you can see as to which economies have been attracting more immigrants out there. And that's a chart I'll show you later, which is that if you really look at the last 10, 20 years, the economic growth rate of the United States has been higher than that of Japan and US and Europe for mainly one reason, and that had to do with better demographics. You strip out demographics, and then the growth rates differential between Japan, Germany, and the US almost disappears. So what that tells you is this entire sort of talk on how the US is more productive, because of a sort of more open system or another Silicon Valley or whatever like you want to talk about it, that is a bit of a myth. That what really makes the US grow faster than Europe and Japan are babies and immigrants, not so much Google and Facebook. So here's what's happening to the female participation in the labor force. And this is a bit of a disturbing trend, and particularly true in some of the developing countries as well, and even here in the United States, that look at how much this has turned in terms of the participation, how much it's come down in many parts of the world. So this is obviously something which leaders need to address about how to increase female participation in the labor force if they want to remain competitive. As I said, extending the working life of the elderly, not popular, but something which some countries are trying to do in terms of the fact that they're trying to increase their retirement ages, and some which are going the other way, I think face a major headwind from doing so. But there are some economies, like in Brazil, as we know, that the retirement and the pension policies are such that people feel happy to retire at the age of 55 or something. That sort of burden on the system is just not sustainable anymore, especially when you have demographic headwinds that you have to deal with. But the interesting thing here is the fact that the state can only do that much to shape demographics. As you can see here, that Mexican men already retire much later than legally required, Italians much earlier, as you would expect. So it is very difficult for the state to move the needle that much because of these deep cultural habits out there. And what doesn't work is baby bonuses. This is something which governments have tried in many parts of the world to give bonuses. Like in Australia, you've had all these sort of slogans that, which I can't repeat in front of a polite audience, but actually proper slogans to encourage more babies that the state has promoted. Only that much success you have had from that. And the other thing, I think that this is now getting much more traction, but something that I've written about a lot over the last couple of years is don't fear the robots. The robots are coming just in time to help. And I think that this is, like the mainstream narrative has been so much about how robots are going to come and take your jobs and automation, all these sort of fears are there. There is absolutely zero evidence of that happening so far. In fact, now we have increased research which is showing in Eastern Europe and in Asia that technology has created more jobs than it has destroyed. In fact, over time, that's the history of the world, that technology kills professions, as someone says, not jobs. So yes, some professions are dying, but net, job growth is very good. Look at this chart. Today, the global unemployment rate is at a multi-decade low. So this, of course, tracks the developed world for which we have data. This is close to a 40-year low. If really robots were a problem and automation was a problem, you wouldn't be seeing this. So I think there's a lot of focus on the dark side about there are some jobs which are being destroyed. That's been very well documented. But there are some new jobs also being created. And in most parts of the world, the new jobs being created are more than offsetting the jobs which are being destroyed. Therefore, the global unemployment rate today is close to a multi-decade low. So as I said, that now you can see here that in most countries, the jobs being created by technology are outnumbering those which are being destroyed. So this is the case of Amazon. So we have all heard about the stories on how Amazon is using more robots, drones, etc. But look at the number of people that Amazon is also employing. That is going up much more dramatically than the number of robots that Amazon is inducting in their labor force. And this is true like in most places. So if you look at the countries which are sort of adopting robots, it's basically those countries which are facing a serious aging problem. Germany, Japan, even China. These are the countries with the highest labor intensity in terms of use of robots out there. And I think that that is a major telling sign about how robots are coming to help rather than hurt. This is the chart that I was referring to like a bit earlier, that in per capita income terms, if you look at it, this is since 2005, we looked at it, the increase in per capita income terms of Japan, US, and Europe has been virtually identical. I think that this is a very telling chart, tells you about the importance of demographics in shaping destinies of nations and also in relative growth rates. Some people may ask that, okay, so if per capita income is growing high, shouldn't that matter more than overall economic growth rates? Possibly for the well-being, but as far as economic might is concerned, overall economic growth rate is what mattered. I mean, as I said, just to put this in context, that if the United States didn't have the demographic advantage compared to Japan and Europe, its economy today would be not only much smaller, but the same words that we use for Japan and Europe about stagnation, the same words we'd be using for the United States as well if we just go by these statistics that we have here in terms of per capita income. So what's the conclusion? Basically, all hands are needed on deck. Why? As I said, that the main demographic threat to the world today is not from a population explosion, but from a possible population implosion, as far as at least the economic growth rates are concerned. Historically, population growth, especially the working age population growth, has accounted for half of overall economic growth. Rapid economic growth is rare if the working age population of a nation is below 2%, and almost impossible if the working age population of a nation is shrinking. In the United States, immigration has obviously played a very important role, as you know, in terms of increasing the working age population of this nation, as has been the case in much of the Anglo-Saxon world. So the advantage of the Anglo-Saxon economic model vis-a-vis, let's say, the Japanese or the European model has not been so much about productivity, but has been really about the demographic advantage and a much more open door policy that these countries have adopted. Now, for the political reality may be shifting now. It's not my sort of business to judge that, but to tell you obviously what the consequences for an economic growth rate perspective are concerned in a world which is facing a much more challenging environment for demographics. So I think that it's this sort of environment that we need to sort of incorporate into our projections much more, rather than having this anchoring bias that the global economy can keep growing at 3 to 4%, because that growth boom between 1950 and 2008 was mainly because of the baby boom, and that boom now is behind us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchir, for your illuminating remarks. We have a large number of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we can get to a few. I see a number of similar questions regarding your views on current anti-globalization and anti-immigrant sentiments and how this plays a role in this demographic story.
No, I think that the answer is very obvious, which is that if you look at it, I think that we are in an era of deglobalization just now. I think that traditionally there have been three metrics to measure globalization. One is the flow of goods and services, two is the flow of capital, and three is the flow of migrants. Those have been the three metrics traditionally to measure globalization. I think that, and we saw that really from the 1970s onwards, and with 1980s, 1990s, in the last decade, these 3 decades were the era of hyper-globalization, where we saw a massive increases in interconnectivity between nations on all these 3 metrics. Post the global financial crisis, on all those 3 metrics, we have seen some sort of a regression, which is that global trade as a share of GDP has stagnated, global capital flows as a share of GDP have fallen back dramatically, as banks in particular are much more sort of circumspect to lend beyond their borders. And global migrant flows also have fallen significantly, especially global migrant flows as in going from east to west or north or south to north. We've seen some more south-south movement, but much less as far as the migration to the developed world is concerned. So that process has also slowed down, possibly because of more barriers which some nations have put up, and possibly more because of the cultural sort of backlash which has come because of migration. So I think that this end of era of globalization or the hyper-globalization obviously isn't great for productivity. And in this sort of environment, you have to look at which nations are going to remain more open, because those nations are going to have a competitive edge over nations which remain more closed. But for political reasons, many nations are turning more closed, and that is obviously not good for their growth prospects. But that's just the reality. And I mean, I think that in the United States as well, I guess you can argue that the good news is going to be that wages are going to increase possibly more sharply than what people are expecting just now, simply because we're reaching full employment and there are labor shortages being reported in many parts of this economy. So you can argue that's in some way like it's good, but long term for productivity, obviously that cannot be good when you sort of have that system being challenged.
So Ruchir, you've provided us with a lot of terrible news, and I'm sort of wondering whether, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us, potentially tell us some good news, and I'll give you 2 possible areas. One thing is there are a large number of countries that are avoiding this demographic trap, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, sub-Saharan African countries, they're not all the same, and there's a lot of heterogeneity there. I wonder if you have specific countries where you sort of see them in a positive light, where the demographics are looking good for them. The other topic I'd like to ask you about is, and numerous participants also asked about this, is we do see a trend for rising labor force participation among older workers. Where do you see that working the best in terms of looking at the different countries, particularly in the industrialized countries where we really have this demographic problem on our hands?
Yeah, so I think that the second question is that in terms of wherever we think that the retirement ages have, are going to like increase in terms of, like we need that to take place. But, like I look at countries like Japan, and they've tried to do that, and I think it's been a bit limiting in terms of how much success they've been able to achieve by increasing their retirement ages, like of the elderly. But I do feel that that is something which is the untapped potential for many countries to do. But in terms of how many nations have the political will to change the retirement age, I think that the last time that the US did that was the 1986 tax reform, I think. But I think that worked because they said it would come into effect 17 years later, so that's the only way to get things done. If I remember correctly, I think that's the way it was done back then. So I think that it's a very difficult thing to do. I don't see too many countries making much progress out there. Now, on the first point, I think that the demographic advantages are there. I think, therefore, I think that as far as India is concerned, the fact that its demographics are much superior as far as China is concerned. I hate making these comparisons between India and China because I find the two countries have nothing in common apart from their large populations, and China is at such a different stage of its development compared to India, with China's per capita income nearly 5 times India's. But still, I think in absolute growth terms, I think that India sort of, should be able to grow much faster because of the demographic stuff, and China's growth rate is possibly going to disappoint more than what people think, partly because of the demographic trend. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind. Now, the countries which I showed you as to where I think the demographic tailwinds are there are mainly concentrated like in Africa. I think that East Africa, has better chances of converting that demographic dividend into some potential compared to West Africa, where I think that the politics and the other problems are much more complicated. And then there's the likes of the Middle East. I mean, we were just discussing, I was recently in Dubai, and the demographic pressure is, I think, something which is the biggest reason why there's so much excitement in that region about the changes in Saudi Arabia. I think everyone's fascinated by what's going on out there. There's a big split with the geopolitical community still very skeptical about what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and the economic community much more optimistic, especially if you go to places like Dubai. But I think it's the demographic push which is coming from that burgeoning population, which is causing Saudi Arabia to undertake these reforms. So there will be some positive catalyst somewhere where the push is such where you have to carry out these reforms. So I'd say that, yeah, Africa, Middle East, but always keep in mind it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for high economic growth.
All right, thank you very much. We only have a couple minutes left, and maybe I'll give you an opportunity. There's several participants who are wondering what's your economic outlook for China's economic growth, say, next 10 years or so, give or take.
Yeah.
What do you forecast?
That's something which I know that I also said in my book, that the old rule of forecasting used to be that you make so many forecasts that you keep reminding people when you're right. I feel that the new rule of forecasting now is that you should forecast so far out in the future that neither you nor I will be here to know whether I was right or wrong. So I would love to make 10, 20-year forecasts because there's no way you can hold me to that. But as an investor, it's very difficult for me to get away with it because I have to put my money where my mouth is. As far as China is concerned, I think that, it's a country which has obviously arrived. We are in a G2 world today where it's the US and China as the two main poles as far as economic growth is concerned. But as I said, that I feel that that there are these 3 Ds which I think are shaping the global economy are also likely to sort of have more negative consequences for China than possibly imagined at this stage. Those 3 Ds are demographics. As I said, China's demographics today are in fact worse than that of the United States, which is a developed nation, which is that their working age population is shrinking, and at least in the US, it's increasing. But the spread is quite significant. The second D, as I said, has to do with debt. There's so much talk about the amount of debt that the US has taken up. But in the US, it's all been government debt. In China, it's the overall debt which has gone up very significantly. They know that. So that's one of the big sort of challenges that Xi Jinping has been speaking about, which is what to do about the debt and how he, in fact, needs more power to delever the economy. But that's something which is there because no emerging market has taken on as much debt as China has taken on in this period of the last decade. China didn't have that much debt as a share of its economy until the global financial crisis of 2008. After that, to try and grow very rapidly at a time when the global economy was slowing down, China basically took on massive amounts of debt. And in the end, I think there is no free lunch. There is a price you have to pay for it. And they have been paying in terms of growth slowing down now as they deal with some of those issues, but possibly growth slows down more than what people think. And the third thing I think has to do with deglobalization. And this is a challenge for many emerging markets, because including China, which is that the model for all these economies to grow rapidly has been to export your way to prosperity. And in a world of deglobalization, it becomes more and more difficult for these economies, including such as China, to rely on that model, because export growth is much more hard to come by rapidly in this environment. So I'd say that, I think there's a lot going on in China. We are very engaged out there. I think that the new economy in China is fascinating. The technological advances that we have all spoken about, that they've been able to create behind closed doors virtually, is something which is quite remarkable. But I do feel that these very mundane 3Ds of demographics, debt, and deglobalization is something which will possibly lead to much slower growth in China overall than what we are expecting today.
Great. Thank you very much, Ruchir, for being here with us.
Thank you.